I'm so pumped. Dr. Jones-Rooy is amazing. And she is our keynote today. You can see there on the screen that she'll be focused on tips for taming the quantitative beast from a fire-eating data scientist. Dr. Jones-Rooy is more than an NYU professor and a data scientist. She is also a comedian, and as we keep hitting on, a fire-eating circus performer. Andrea serves currently as a professor and director of undergraduate studies at the NYU Center for Data Science, where she teaches their popular flagship course, Data Science for Everyone. Andrea, when we had the opportunity to engage with you at one of the previous Innovates, one of the most exciting things to me was data science has always been this very intimidating word, right? In subject matter. And so I'm so pumped that you get to bring this to the larger audience. As you've done your work in social science, whether it's the books that you've written, the research that you've done, the consultancies that you've held, I feel like you have brought accessibility, right, to data. So I will stop talking and turn it over to you so that the world can experience the accessibility that I have with data science.
Well, thank you very much. And for the record, I would be happy to hear you continue sharing about the importance of accessibility in data science. And I very much believe that data science is something that we should not be afraid of, if that makes sense. And it's something that a lot of people hear it. And as you described, it's sort of this like mystery box of what could be in it and what could it mean. And maybe it's just sort of magic. And I am here to, disabuse all of us of that notion, perhaps by disappointing everyone about data science, and in particular about what we mean by data and what we mean by science. And I want to also acknowledge that I'm coming on the heels of a great conversation where literally you just left off talking about the importance of thinking about how things are measured and that you have consistent data. And that's absolutely what I'm going to be focused on as well today. So thank you so much for having me. Indeed, I was with Capture Higher Ed in person in Philadelphia. And I also want to say that was my last trip. I'm in New York City. That was my last trip out of the city and out of the house, really, before we all went inside. So you are my main focal point when I think of what the world, what my memories of the world. Okay, enough preamble. Indeed, I am a data scientist and I teach data science, and I believe very strongly that we can all and should all be data scientists, and that the skills required to be a thoughtful data scientist are not just a lot of programming and a lot of stats, though that's part of it, but I think that we can all participate in data science right this second with just a few important kind of ways of thinking. And that's what I'm going to focus on today. And as for the fire eating, if it all goes wrong, I'll set something on fire in my house and we'll do that instead. Okay. So motivation for today. So we're all drowning in data. This is a time when all you need to do is go online and you can find data about anything. You can hire folks to provide more data for you. You can go out and collect your data. There is so much data, and so many of us have access to it, which is awesome. But it's overwhelming, right? And I am finding in my own work, and I imagine many of you are in this position as well, we have so many more questions about the world that we feel like we should be able to answer with data, but there's this disconnect between, more spreadsheets than I know what to do with, and dashboards and algorithms and predictive models and all this kind of stuff, and then big questions, like many of the questions that are happening in the world, or at least in the United States and in many places around the world right now, about things like equity and justice, right? How do we use data to help us understand and address big questions? So the focus for today is just a tiny piece of things that we might be able to do to kind of reconcile this difference, right? So I'm going to share 3 tips for making the most of mountains of data, especially data about humans, and especially for studying abstract things. Who am I? There was a very generous introduction just now, so I'll keep this brief. I am a professor of data science, and I got my Ph.D. in political science at the University of Michigan, and have taught at Carnegie Mellon and helped build the quantitative social science program at NYU Shanghai. So I am coming at data science from a very social science, a strong social science bias, in that I am personally most interested in data about humans. And I suspect that many of you in the joining this conference are also interested in data about humans. In this context, I do a lot of research with companies. I partner mostly with large companies, but I've also worked as a consultant to data journalism organizations as well as research institutes to help us understand how to use data science to ask and answer thorny questions about diversity and identity and equity in companies. So I will be speaking about that. I imagine this audience, there's a lot of interest in applying data science to questions around higher education. And I don't professionally engage in data science for higher education, but of course, within my role, I think about both of these things a lot. So my examples are going to come from the corporate world, but they absolutely apply broadly. And I'm currently thinking about applying them more broadly. So here are my 3 tips. All right. You can look at this and then walk away. Right. So number 1, measurement. Measurement is central to making the most out of data. And if you're not doing the measuring, understanding who did the measuring and how they did it and what you think about that is key to beginning to quantify the seemingly unquantifiable. I believe, let me see if I stand by this. I believe that everything is quantifiable in principle. In practice, all our measures are imperfect. The question is how imperfect, and can we still generate insights despite their imperfections? So, second thing I want to say, related, I want to talk specifically about how we've conflated data with truth and why they are not the same thing and what to do about it. And then my top tips for measuring humans, just the ones that I am most often shouting at companies about and other folks who want to get out there and start doing measurement themselves. So my background is as a political scientist, which means I was originally trained in trying to measure things like war. And war seems like it would be very easy to measure, right? It's a grim topic, of course, but it's like, I don't know, it's 2 countries gone to war, which means a bunch of people have died and therefore it's a war. But it starts to really matter when you get into the details. Is it a war if 100 people die? What if 50 people die? What if it's civilians rather than soldiers? And so forth. Even this question is very, very difficult. And we have a lot of data sets about war that have been around for a few decades, but they're still very much under discussion. And if we measure war differently, if the cutoff is 100 deaths versus 50 deaths, it can really affect our results and our policies. A lot of people are trying to study things like democracy and elections. We are hearing nonstop about the importance of understanding whether elections are free and fair, who gets to participate. And there's mountains of work going on to try to measure fair and free elections. And that's really, really tough. So that's my kind of formal training. Now I spend a lot of time, don't get me wrong, I'm still thinking about these things too, but I increasingly spend time talking with companies who want to measure other things. And this absolutely applies to campus cultures as well. Well, maybe we want more trust in our organization. How do we measure trust? How do we know there's trust or there isn't, or our interventions are increasing a culture of trust? Now, a number one sign, if what you're looking into measuring, a number one sign that there's not good measures for it is do a Google image search and see what the images are. And for trust, we're really in the dark because you just get words. There's not even a picture, right? No one knows. So we have a lot of work to do from the measurement perspective. Other things that I spend a lot of time working with companies on, and I think in the last couple of weeks in the United States, at least, it has become more obviously urgent than ever before, well, at least in my lifetime, of measuring things related to diversity. How do we know if diversity is increasing? What do we mean by diversity? Who are we including in what counts as diversity, and who are we excluding? If you Google image search diversity, one of the top results is tomatoes. Nothing against the wide variety of tomatoes out there, but that's not quite enough. Yeah? Okay. Never mind other topics that perhaps we care about. Again, very much relevant to life on college campuses in societies. Inclusion, belonging, respect, privilege. How do we put numbers on those things and do so in a thoughtful way that improves understanding and doesn't exclude groups? Okay. So the key from translating, so I'm not arguing that there's there's no truth out there in the world, right? I believe the truth is out there. I support the X-Files slogan, right? There is truth, companies have more or less trust or more or less diversity with respect to whatever dimension you want to focus on. But the data that we have isn't just a mirror copy of that. There's been a human intervention of measurement. And anytime we look at something and say, I want to understand that, I want to turn it into data, we're taking 2 steps. And again, if you are doing the collection, great, this applies to you. But if you're being given data, these are things you should ask. So what were the 2 steps taken to turn this thing I'm interested in into data? The 2 steps, and these are words you can absolutely bandy about at cocktail parties whenever we can go back out and go to those and really dazzle and alienate all your friends and say, well, how was that conceptualized? How was that operationalized? So conceptualize the thing I want to measure, trust in my company. What do I mean by that? How do I conceptualize trust? It could mean many things. Let me narrow it down for now and recognize that's an imperfect narrowing, but we've got to start somewhere. Number 2, how am I actually going to measure it? Am I going to ask people? Am I going to observe behavior and take notes? Am I going to use data around retention or applications or complaints issued, etc.? So there are 2 steps, right? What do I mean? How am I going to turn that into numbers? So one example that I talk about with companies all of the time, and I really want to acknowledge that this is such an important issue, and I am speaking about this as a white person, and so obviously I'm coming with my blinders, massive blinders, but I want to talk about the importance of continuing to think about how we measure these things and focus on improving diversity in companies, and I will stand by that normative or political statement. The number one thing when I work with companies is they don't even plan. They don't even conceptualize diversity. They just sort of mean diversity, but they're not clear. Do you mean gender? Do you mean race? Do you mean Black employees? Do you mean Black, Indigenous, and people of color? Do you mean different nationalities, religions, disability, economic backgrounds? Most companies don't even bother to clarify that. And again, focusing on it doesn't mean, oh, the others don't matter, but it means being very clear. A lot of companies that I work with say they are trying to measure diversity, and what they're really measuring is gender. And even then, the gender binary, right? So being very clear about what you're measuring in the first place is important, both for transparency about what you mean by your goals, and also will affect your goals directly. Then how do you operationalize that? Suppose I care about economic background of students, right? Are you going to do a survey with as many, inclusive options as possible? Are you going to offer the opportunity to self-identify? Are you relying on, financial aid applications and things like that? What is your actual operationalization? If you're stuck, so a lot of times I work with companies who are freaking out. I care about diversity. And right now, my phone is ringing off the hook with companies saying, what do I do about racism in my company? Well, if you're stuck, why do you want to know this? And what are you going to do with that information? Once you have a plan for your measurement, or you've gotten data from someone who's done the measurement and you've decided that that's your focus, you've got to critique that measurement right out of the gates, right? First of all, these are sensitive topics. They're often protected categories that you can't even necessarily ask about in companies. I'm not sure the rules in higher education. We're also leaving out a lot of things. And our prioritization is a decision of its own, right? Implicit or explicit. Finally, people might not be comfortable sharing this information. What are some of the things we can do to make folks more comfortable, but also acknowledge that our data is simply going to be incomplete and use that to inform our results? So what are the limitations or risks of our measurement approach, and how can we improve? Here's what I see most people do. It seems rather obvious. Yeah, if I want to measure something, what do I mean by it? How do I turn it into a number? Here's what I see. Oh my gosh, I'm an organization and I care about diversity. Here are all the metrics I can think of related to demographic identity, education background, and oh my God, let's do something with that. And then we're just stuck. We have all this data and we don't feel like we're answering any of our questions. And again, I say this as a white person with a very biased perspective, but this is what I'm seeing from my vantage point. So should we go out there and collect more data? Should we try to understand something in our data? Should we build, I support, machine learning and predictive models, but what goes into that model? What should I be even trying to focus on or understand with my models, right? So for example, I'm talking with a lot of companies right now about retention of Black employees. They probably have a bunch of data on this. They have data on when they were hired, previous employers, education background, roles, promotion history, 360 reviews, salary at peer organizations, or maybe at least approximations, right? And all of this is still assuming, hopefully they've thoughtfully gotten data about a person's racial identity in the first place and not made assumptions about that, but okay. They might say from here, I need more. I need to understand. I still don't know what to do, right? And so you might spend a lot of money saying, how can we understand if our Black employees are actively looking for other jobs? Or if they have a sense of belonging? And this is coming from a good place. I hope our Black talent feel they belong. How could I understand that, right? Maybe engagement data could help me, a workplace satisfaction survey. And that's going to cost a lot of money. And what that's probably going to do is get you more columns in your data set that you can stare at forever and ever and ever and not really get anywhere. And by the way, these are all white men, because when I talk to leaders of companies, they're mostly white men, and they are frustrated and they don't know what to do. And I have one humble idea for what to do, which is let's use the scientific method. I don't know about you, but I first learned about the scientific method when I was in 3rd grade. We dissected owl pellets, and I thought it was gross and boring. And it took 8 years in grad school for me to be broken down and convinced that there's value in the scientific method. So if you are grappling with data, you have something that you've measured or are thinking about measuring, but don't know where to start here. Be curious. Don't jump to say, what's the answer? What do I do? Be curious. Ask a question. Why are Black employees leaving the company? Number one, this is an aside from measurement, but as a diversity consultant extra, that doesn't mean get all your Black employees in a room and make them do free labor, right? You are the person thinking about this, so you think about this. What could be some of the reasons? Perhaps you've gotten information elsewhere before that you can work from, you can educate yourself, and so forth, right? If you have a trusted person that you can ask, of course, have those conversations, but don't rely on one person to speak for everyone. You have this data if you are in charge. And again, this is a specific example, but it applies to a lot of context. So I can observe that over the last 10 years, Black employees are leaving at X rate, which is 5 times more frequently than white or whatever. I can form a theory, right? I've hopefully done a lot of educating of myself, et cetera, but I can form a theory. I think a lack of inclusion leads to disengagement. Okay, that's maybe an imperfect theory. The word inclusion assumes a lot of things about what the kind of norm should be, but okay, that's your working theory, right? What does that look like? Your hypothesis. What would that look like in the data if my theory is right? What's my observable implication? If it's the case that lack of inclusion leads to disengagement, I need to be more specific about measuring that. So maybe, and again, this comes from a super superficial white perspective, but as a thought experiment, maybe one starting point is, are Black employees getting talked over at meetings? At least that's a starting point. That certainly doesn't solve the problem, but it's a start, right? I can now collect data on that. I now know what to look for rather than pure organization salaries and this and that, which maybe are valuable. I at least have a focal point, right? So sit in a room. You don't have to be, this is where data science, anyone can be a data scientist. Sit in a room and take notes. Hopefully you have a culture of trust for this sort of thing, right? But okay, I'm going to count. I used to do this when I was a teaching assistant as a grad student. Our fellow grad students and I would take turns sitting in each other's classrooms and sitting in the back. Back then, we were, I'm sorry to say, we were only focused on gender. This was about 10 years ago. And we would sit in the back of each other's classrooms and take notes. And at the end, come up and say, you called on, 60% of the students you called on were men rather than women, right? And that was information for me. So you can be a data scientist by taking turns sitting in a room. Again, make sure you have everyone's buy-in on this. Or speaking time. How many times was someone interrupted? How much airtime did someone get in a meeting? How about on average, right? And then we can think about what to do from that. And again, that's one tiny piece, but unless we're specific, we're not actually going to learn anything, right? So if my theory is correct, more being talked over should be associated with leaving the company. Now I have my data on being talked over, and I have my data on leaving the company, and I can look for associations. Yes, associations are not causation, but my goodness, is it a start? We revise our theory and we repeat. And what I really want to emphasize is this isn't answering the problem. My hypotheses might totally miss the mark and come from a place of just being totally disconnected, but it's how you can turn mountains of data into a question that then can be answered. And then you iterate. And the other reason I wanted to walk through this is to really emphasize that data and data science and all of that our obsession with more numbers plays a role only in observation and collecting data. Everything else requires us sitting and thinking and asking questions. Hooray, look at those animations. So takeaways, right? If you're overwhelmed with data or you don't know what to collect, asking questions helps you begin from a place of curiosity, which leads to more discovery and openness. Posing our theories and hypotheses guides us. It tells us what data to start with. Again, start with. This isn't an end-all, be-all, but to just take a step. Key questions to ask, what is it that I think is happening? If I'm right, what should we be seeing in the world? And that will help tell you what to measure. And then you can think about how to conceptualize and operationalize. So I've already talked a little bit about why data does not equal truth, because humans are doing the measurement. Let's be even more specific. Then I'll get to my much more concrete tips. So data does not equal truth. Somewhere along the way, we have gotten distracted or maybe hopeful, as I think, as a species. That's right, I'm speaking on behalf of all humans. A species curious about ourselves and the world. And we have somehow decided that turning something into a number makes it correct and true. And there's no more, to me, obvious example of this as when people say to me and to each other, what did the data say? I cannot emphasize enough that data does not say anything. Data is an imperfect approximation of what's happening in the real world. There's the real world. We as humans have decided what to measure, how to measure, what questions we care about, and we've taken those decisions and plucked certain pieces from the world to have a look at. So it's an imperfect approximation in time. Did the data I collect last year, is that reflective of this year anyway? And it's an imperfect approximation because my sample, whether I've collected from my hometown or I've collected 100 people at random, maybe I missed all these other things, right? It's an imperfect approximation in both time and place. That doesn't mean we throw it away. It means we're cognizant of that. As I said, it's also a human construct. So what we measure and how we measure it, that conceptualization and operationalization, is a human decided that. And so when you see a number in a spreadsheet or you see the results of a model, the way to think about that as a data scientist is to say, what went into generating these numbers? It's exactly what the conversation before this presentation was about. What went into these numbers? It's not just what do the numbers say. They don't say anything. Someone decided what to measure. We're having a look at it. And now we are deciding what the patterns are from there. So human biases and errors are a big part of what can go into data. So when you are given a data set or the results from an analysis, here are 4 big types of biases to go on the lookout for. And I will say, in my Data Science for Everyone course, I spend like 6 years, give or take, on this topic, and we're going to do it in a couple minutes. So it's a lot. So if you're looking at a data set or someone says, here's the results of my analysis based on a data set, here's what to look for. First, there's possible random errors. And in fact, every data set is going to have random errors. These are measurement errors, idiosyncratic mistakes. I'm typing up the data or I'm importing something from here and I write 4.6 instead of 4.7. Random error, right? A faulty instrument. I have a thermometer. It's a little bit wrong, right? But it's idiosyncratically wrong. We hope that these errors cancel out over time. But what that means, and that's where we see, one of the reasons we see, margins of error around any measure, is we don't know what we're picking up and there's just going to be some noise all around. But we hope it's not systematic. But we still acknowledge it's not a pinpoint prediction, right? It's still got some noise. But if it's systematic, we need to have another conversation. And we always must be on the lookout for this in data. Systematic data is data that is missing or incorrect in a way that's consistent, systematic, and relevant to our inferences. So for example, if I'm doing a survey and I'm only, and I'm trying to understand, satisfaction with my company or whatever, right? Who participates in the survey? There's going to be a systematic bias, right? We know this if we look at like Yelp reviews and Amazon reviews, teaching evaluations, all these sorts of things where normally people who agree to participate in a survey are people who already care. So you're probably going to oversample people who really love and really hate whatever it is you're trying to understand, right? Who is it that visits your website? That's a selection bias of people who already somehow have heard from you. This doesn't mean we throw data away. It means we adjust our inferences. Usually that means, is this biasing my results up or biasing my results down, right? So, or biasing my results to the extreme. Probably most people don't really love and really hate my company. They're probably somewhere in the middle. How do I account for that when I draw my inferences? 2 deeper ones that I think don't get as much airtime as systematic biases or selection bias. So one is validity, which is when we aren't measuring what we think we're measuring. And this is where that conceptualization and operationalization is huge, and we always must interrogate that. So a very big example is measuring things like intelligence or trying to predict success in college using scores like SATs. I sit on the admissions program for our data science masters, our admissions team for our data science masters program. And we look for top performance in on the GREs, right? And we are implicitly or sometimes explicitly saying yes because we believe this predicts something important about who's likely to succeed, right? Well, increasingly, we are talking, I think usefully, about the fact that maybe SATs and standardized exams are not so much picking up aptitude or skill as they are preparedness for the exam, which itself is picking up where you grew up, who your parents are, access to certain networks, access to resources, etc. So always questioning, we're using this measure, but are we really picking up what we think we are is key. One big area I see this play out in companies is they're obsessed with, they want to assess their talent, right? How do we recognize top talent? And one thing that everyone wants to look for is leadership. Okay, how do we conceptualize leadership? What do we mean by that? How do we operationalize it, right? But typically what happens is we say we care about leadership, and everyone goes around and rates someone on a scale of 1 to 5 to how much of a leader they are, and then you promote those people. Well, are we picking up leadership, or are we picking up a very narrow view of what the majority of people in that company think of as leadership, which my guess for most companies is loud, outspoken white men. I'll say it, right? That's probably what they're picking up. So this could really undermine our inferences and subsequent policies. And I want to say that that's my observation so far. I'm not speaking universally. Exclusion is another deep type of error in all of our data sets. So it means we haven't measured something or asked about something because it hasn't even occurred to us. So some examples that I see in companies that I'm talking to is not measuring things like mental illness. A lot of times when we think about policymaking, we don't think about incarcerated populations. They don't make it into our data sets. I think literally right now as we speak, all these companies that I've been talking to and universities that have been to date obsessed with diversity are now freaking out. I think, rightly, that's my personal view, freaking out because they're not really focusing on racial diversity and in particular Black students and Black talent. So even by saying diversity, we're perhaps excluding big groups within that in our broader bucket, right? So it's a kind of prioritization in itself. So one thing that can help is have a diverse team with respect to anything that you care about, working on your data science project. So they can say, I think we're missing this population. Why haven't we checked in on this sort of thing? What we can all think about from our own viewpoint, no matter who we are, is narrowed by our personal experiences and our wisdom and our background. So the more different people are helping you think of what to measure and what to study, the better. Last thing, my top tips for measuring humans. And here's that fire. This is as close as we get. So hooray, a little bit of fire. So if you are thinking, gosh, I better go out and measure some humans, here's what I recommend. And these are in kind of a order of how often I find myself repeating this to people. How about that? So number one of the worst ways to find out what humans do is ask them directly. A very strong example of this is in research on why people vote. If you poll Americans, I don't know the latest numbers, but typically if you poll Americans and say, are you planning to vote in the next election? Or did you vote in the last election? 70% of Americans say, yeah, absolutely. Well, we know that 40% of Americans voted in the midterm elections, right? Maybe it was 50 actually for this past one, but typically it's more like 40, right? So that's a lot of people who are lying to us, right? Think about another one is, how often do you go to the gym? I overstate that because my true answer is 0 or maybe even -1, right? Another big one that comes out of political science and other social science survey research is a really bad way to find out if someone is racist is to say, are you racist? It turns out there are techniques in how we ask questions to get a little bit more information. A good way to understand what humans think they do is to ask them directly. How often do you think you exercise? How often do you think you vote? Or how often do you think I want to hear that you vote or exercise? That's a good thing that you can understand from those sorts of surveys, right? Another way around this is to say, what are you observing? So it turns out if you ask, and again, we don't totally know the ultimate validity of this, but rather than, for example, ask someone, are you racist? You ask them, do you know anyone who is racist? And all of a sudden their answer goes from no to, oh yeah, right? That doesn't mean they're racist, but if what we're trying to understand is racism, that's something. What proportion of your friends do you think are going to vote? How do you think they're going to vote in the next election? Those measures tend to be better predictors, we think. The decision to measure itself is a kind of prioritization. And again, I see it happening in real time as companies who've been implicitly measuring gender are realizing that they've now prioritized gender over race and other dimensions of diversity. It's also a kind of signal to people who are being measured about what matters, right? measurement is intervention and communication. If you're running a survey within your company or within people who've worked with your company or whatever, what you're asking about is an opportunity to share what you care about. I had a big conversation with someone who I was helping design a survey a long time ago where, well, a couple years ago, but it feels like decades, right? Where the question was, it was about religion and like end of life plans. And it was a grim survey, but it was important. And at the end, we had some demographic questions, race, gender identity, and so forth. Racial identity, gender identity, where you are in the country, et cetera. And for gender identity, I propose that we list, cis male, cis female, transgender male, transgender female, third gender, non-binary, gender, et cetera, right? I suggested a full suite or a close to full suite. And he said, well, we're not actually ever going to divide the population up like that because the sample sizes will be very small. So shouldn't we just ask male and female? Because in our analysis, that's all we're going to pay attention to, which is its own conversation, right? But statistically, and to be fair to folks, if there's just a few people who are responding, you shouldn't share the results because they can be, de-anonymized. But okay. But the point that I made to him was, even if we don't use that data, the act of asking is a signal of what matters and what we recognize. So, okay. So before you go out and measure or cast about for data or ask people for data, think very carefully about what it is you hope to find out and why. Ask yourself before you do surveys. There's a lot of survey fatigue in particular, and I love writing a survey, right? But what can I do without surveys, right? Surveys are useful to tell the why, but often the why is still even biased with what we think is going on. But can I use observational data that's already being generated ethically before I start intervening directly? Asking about one thing at a time is key. A lot of times people try to fold multiple topics into one question, and then you can't really understand the results. For validity, what does this measure rule in or rule out? For example, if I go back to my example of let's measure, equity as everyone gets to speak in a meeting. Cool. What does that rule in? Well, it rules in behavior in a meeting and a couple other things. What does it rule out? All the other touch points we have and conversations we have during a meeting. That doesn't mean we ignore this, but we keep track of the broader context. Deciding how to measure in the first place is potentially useful for other work. Even that step, and I skimmed right over it because I don't have a good answer, of like, well, what do we mean by trust? Even if you never go out and measure it, just be like, ooh, if I want to increase trust in my company, what on earth do I mean by that, right? That alone is a huge step and can move conversations and understanding forward. Even if you never, kind of put pen to paper or finger to keyboard to measure it, right? Finally, I see this a lot in companies, is once you engage in measurement, think about what behaviors this might incentivize. So in the example of leadership measures that I talked about before, because folks at this particular company that I'm describing are measured in leadership, and because leadership is poorly defined, and because generally the leadership, the high levels in that company are quite loud, there's a culture of talking over one another and being the loudest voice in the room in order to get attention and to be listened to, means that as long as you keep measuring it that way, that's going to incentivize younger employees and more junior employees to also behave in that way. So if we're going to change what we're measuring, how are we going to inadvertently affect in positive or negative ways? So thinking about that, because we're humans and we react to how we're measured, right? All right. So that was a lot. Please don't hesitate to get in touch. This was more like, here's all the problems with measurement, but a few things that we can all do to hopefully measure a little bit more effectively as we go forward. And at minimum, if you walk away saying, I want to question what's in the data and how the measurement behind that data, how it was collected, what we're even focusing on, what some of the unintended consequences are of that, both for inference and policy. If you are thinking about that going forward, then I think you're all on your way to being data scientists. And oh my gosh, look at these graphics. My future in graphic design is here and now. All right, that is what I have for you. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see the screen, but I think and hope we have time for questions.
I'd actually like to kick it off with a question. And Heather, I look to you maybe to elaborate further. Again, Andrea, it's great to see you again.
Great to see you too.
Thank you.
Also, I'm inadvertently wearing like team colors. I feel like everyone has red sleeves on.
It is.
So hooray.
Red for Ed.
Yeah.
So one of the questions I want to ask, our industry, especially within the enrollment area, we love to use surveys. It is something we do, through some of the key steps of the enrollment decision journey. Once someone's applied, now, they've been admitted. And, Heather, did you want to highlight, because we get asked that quite a bit from our clients and our partners, and we hear it quite a bit, like we should include a survey. We should send a survey to the parent. Heather, did you want to add anything? But I think that is a really critical component. If you can just elaborate further on, it seems to be a quick go-to that we sometimes rush into. And I think we don't take a step back onto, like you just said, why are we doing this? And some of the other empirical benefits. Heather, did you want to elaborate?
Yeah, Andrea, I think in our industry, right, there are only a few tools that we feel like we can access in order to gain that qualitative information, right? And one of the challenges that I see, even in our own business of creating surveys for institutions, I think goes back to your point of really understanding the why, right? What is important to ask and how to construct it from there. Can you talk about the work that you have done with various organizations, and is that the tool? Is that the primary mechanism, or is there a different way to think about this?
That's a great question, and I think there's I think there's no right answer, which is a really skating by and avoiding the question, but there are times and places for surveys to be extremely effective, and I make part of my living designing and executing and analyzing surveys, so I'm the number one to be like, wait, we love a survey, right? But I think the issue is that in my experience when I'm working with companies, right, the instinct to go to a survey is something of a knee-jerk reaction rather than taking the time to actually think through what you think is going on. So I want to give a very specific example that is within a particular company where they formed a committee because their engagement numbers were horrible, and they thought that it's a super non-inclusive place to work. What do we do to make it better? And they did focus groups, and they had done surveys in the past, and they brought me in and said, let's do another survey. And to me, I literally, happy to do it, happy to take your money, but I was just like, I don't think this is what you need right now. This is a company in this particular case of like 100 people. You've been talking about this for years. Start with that first step of what is it that I think as an employee is going on? Or maybe you have a focus group who can get a bunch of diverse perspectives, but not just handpick the few more diverse people and force them to do it, right? But get everyone. What do you think is going on? How do you think you would be able to test the observable implications of what you think? Do you think leaders are not listening to the voices of people in meetings who are different from them? If that's the case, you don't need to take up everyone's energy with another survey. You can start by exploring that empirically and think very thoughtfully about, again, is it simply observing meetings? Is it just following those couple of leaders? Is it maybe just a coaching for that leader and seeing if things get better, depending on how urgent the issue is? And so it's kind of like before you jump just to survey, okay, I'm not a medical professional, and I shouldn't even have to say that because I'm going to be, it's like the antibiotics of the medical world. It's like there's a great use for them, right? But you don't want to overdo it, and you definitely don't want to use it as an excuse for not doing the thinking yourself. A lot of employee resource groups, student groups, teachers groups, whatever, are already telling us what's going wrong, and I think taking that at face value and then exploring empirical observations of that we could possibly get short of surveys is a better first step before leaping to a survey. I will also say, if you're going to do a survey, 2 quick things to think about. One is maybe you want to understand a lot of times within the diversity space, people want to understand like the demographics in their company, and they want to understand, of course, race, gender, ethnicity, nationality, et cetera. But sometimes they want to understand things like mental illness, disability status, religion, and things that, socioeconomic background that you grew up in. I've worked with companies that ask about that. That's really sensitive stuff. Typically, asking about that kind of stuff, that's its own survey. If you're going to ask about really intense identity questions, ask that. And then if you're separately going to do like engagement questions and satisfaction questions, yes, you want to be able to triangulate between the two, but sometimes you're going to get less honest answers if you're also asking people for very personal identities, because they will fear that you're going to be able to triangulate their results. So it's like, ask the identity questions, ask the sensitive questions. It can protect your workers to ask them separately, though from a scientific perspective, we would love to have those together.
Sure. Andrea, you've played so many different roles, right? Educator, researcher, consultant, etc.
It's a nightmare. It's a true nightmare. Yes.
Flip hats, right? Talk to us about in the world of data and in the world of social science and in the different roles that you play. What have been some of the more challenging experiences that you've had?
From the perspective of data scientists?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean,
I was going to say, burning my mouth.
Right? Maybe not within your researcher community, right?
Right.
But as you are approaching young men and women who are students and people in industry, right, who don't necessarily grasp fully the concept of data and how to use it in a responsible manner. Right. What have been some of the more challenging moments for you in those environments?
I think it's a really great question. Thank you for allowing me to commence the airing of grievances, right? You're like, how many hours do we have? I was like, another thing that happened. But I think generally, right? Here's why I started this kind of rampage about data isn't truth is either, so a lot of times what happens with companies is I am hired, and I love doing this work, I'm hired to carry out the research projects that I've described at a high level here, right? And often that doesn't include a survey, but it's not the only thing that it includes, right? I will do a bunch of work and I will spend, months and months and months on it. Companies will spend money on this, and then I will be brought in to speak to the CEO or the C-suite or the head of whatever area of the business I've been asked to help investigate. And I will present the results, and they will say, I don't think that's right. And you're like, okay. And number one, I want to acknowledge that all data science and all science is tentative and imperfect, and we can never prove anything. So in a sense, they're correct. It's not right. But rather than say, it's not useful, and I think sometimes, and they weren't arguing with the results. They were arguing with well, that's different from what I thought was going on. Therefore, it's wrong. And maybe I totally missed the mark. But the better question, if you're a leader and you're given results, is how did you come to that conclusion? How confident are you in those results? And I will be the first to say, look, it's from a small sample. It's from this. It's only the people who are willing to talk to me, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's definitely imperfect. But normally the knee-jerk reaction is either it's consistent with the narrative the leader already has, in which case they love it, or it's not, in which case it's totally thrown away. And the right answer, I think, is somewhere in between, which is, I'm surprised. Let's probe further, right? Mm-hmm. And that's a bias in science generally, right? If we find results that are inconsistent with our theory, we tend to keep checking and looking for bugs. But if we do results and it's oh, that's what we thought, we just stop there. So I'm not hating on CEOs. I'm hating on everyone, right? You can quote me on that. Hating on everyone.
And there's another question out there.
Yes.
Regarding surveys, our previous question. What is the shelf life of the survey data?
Absolutely amazing question. I actually just had a student asking me about this yesterday who was looking at data on protests and protest effectiveness from 2016. And the question was, is that still relevant given all the changes, right? So what's the shelf life of any empirical data is a massive and deep philosophical question. Survey data, I would say again, I'm going to kind of skirt the question a little bit just by saying it depends. But it depends on what you're trying to understand. And if you think there's a real reason to expect it to be out of date. So let me give you an example from deep in political science and international relations. Is political scientists who try to understand the causes of war have decided that we should divide our data from before the end of the Soviet Union and since. And there's arguments now about, do we think about that in terms of pre or post 9/11, right? And it's not obvious when insights or patterns go out of date. If it's a survey, the questions I would be asking are, were there major changes in the world? And I think there have been some that would affect whatever it is you're trying to study. If what you're trying to understand is something like support for a particular policy, that can change really fast. If it's something like, your, I'm making this up, typical behaviors that you do, that probably changes pretty slowly. So it kind of depends what it is that you're studying. But I will say that a simple knee-jerk reaction of like, oh, this survey's from last year, therefore it's not valid, is misses the mark, right? A more sophisticated interpretation is, well, this is what we had in 2019. I forgot what year it was. In 2019, I was like, who knows, right? This is what we had 10 years ago in 2020, right? This is what we had in 2019. Here's what I think, the numbers are likely to be this year if we did it again, if that makes sense. And that's where it's like humans making guesses and getting the viewpoints of many people. And someone else might come along and be like, we totally can't use that because X, Y, or Z policy changed, right? Mm-hmm. For example, last thing, this is a really long answer. At least at NYU, there's a lot of conversations about whether teaching evaluations in the spring 2020 semester hold. And I think that there have been enough events that maybe we say, all right, that survey data is in its own category, and we shouldn't lump it in with all the others if we're trying to understand trends. So it really depends.
Heather, I have another question. Did you have another question?
Go for it.
Okay, I'm going to go for it. One of the things you mentioned in regards to bias, you talked about exclusion. Mm-hmm. And we have, obviously for us within an institution, we have a number of different areas that, compile our data for us, like NYU, like Carnegie Mellon, and there are whole departments that, clearly focus on assessing the institutional data. In many, in all cases, we submit to the federal government. But as it relates to enrollment offices, depending on the size of the institution, those departments are perhaps not as sophisticated. And it's sometimes, as you brought up, exclusion of critical data can impact your assessment. Mm-hmm. I kind of feel like I'm in like a really bad catch, like a knockoff version of Catch-22 now. Well, how do I know what I excluded? And all I know is kind of what I know, and I think I'm doing the best by going to all my publications within my my professional sphere. I kind of throw it back on you. Well, how does one find that answer of what was that data element or elements that they're
right? Yeah, and not to get too unknowns about all of this, but you're absolutely right. And when I talk about errors of exclusion in my own courses with students, I'm always, every semester I sit and I'm like, well, what are some examples? And I'm like, oh, by definition, I can't think of them, right? My go-tos, I will say, incarcerated populations, mental illness, the Romani populations in Europe, I can kind of name a few that I know are historically excluded, but by definition, we don't know what we're excluding. And I think this is one step forward is to just say, whatever it is that I'm studying is definitely missing things. And the more we can put our research, whether, it's internal company research or something that you're sharing with others, in front of others and say, well, what is it that I might be missing here? And this is both, groups that we might be missing or things that I might not even think to ask about, right? Mm-hmm. My silly example of getting talked over in meetings, I wouldn't do that study without actually talking with folks and saying, well, what actually is, what are some real behaviors that matter, right? And trying to get multiple perspectives on that. But again, also acknowledging that we're never going to get everything, and then constantly just inviting questions about, inviting information about what we might be missing is the best that we can do, right?
Yep. Absolutely. Thank you. Do you want to talk paper, scissors, Heather, for the next question? No, okay, you get to go.
So as we have gotten to know you through time, right? One of the really interesting things that you produce is a live show called Ask a Political Scientist. Can you talk to us a little? It's a little off-industry moment, but I think the work that you're doing there is pretty interesting.
Oh, well, thank you. Yes, it's I'm so excited. So it's a live streaming YouTube show on Thursdays at 7 p.m. The channel is called Ask a Political Scientist on YouTube. And if you Google me, you'll find it because it's literally all I talk about. And so my Ph.D. is in political science, and I think we do great work and no one knows about it. And so every week I spotlight a political scientist to share their research. And then we take live questions from the audience, kind of like this, right? We all get live streams now. This is the new normal for sure. And we talk about how their research affects everything that's going on these days, right? So last week we had someone named Omar Wasso, who's a professor of politics at Princeton, who did a ton of research on Black protests in the 1960s and how they impacted elections during that decade. And so, of course, he shared those insights and then his thoughts on what that meant for the protests now. This week, we're talking about racism that's baked into political science itself. Speaking of errors of exclusion, for a long time, political science thought that asking people about race and how race influences politics is not even like a mainstream question. It was like edge stuff that no one really thought about. And so we're talking about the history of racism within political science. Next week, we're going to go to something much more upbeat, like voter suppression or something like that. So it's all it's meant to be as nonpartisan as we can and more spotlighting really great quantitative and qualitative research. And we have back episodes on religion in politics, the role of anger in politics, anxiety in politics, hit close to home for me, and that sort of thing. Yeah. Thanks. Awesome. And we raise money for different orgs every week as well.
I love it. Lynn, did you have another question? I know I stepped right over you.
You got it.
Andrea, I feel like I have spent my career flirting with data, right? I was an enrollment manager, and my greatest tool was an Excel spreadsheet and pivot tables, right? When I learned how to use.
I love a good pivot table. I really do. Yeah,
just is satisfying. As folks in our industry, right, where even a decade ago, data wasn't as key as it is today, right? The analytics of enrollment, the understanding of human behavior that's layered in numbers, right? Mm-hmm. As you think about that context, what would be a couple of just beginner tips that you would offer to an enrollment manager as we continue to dive deeper and have greater expectations of ourselves and our colleagues with regard to analytics?
Great question. I would say, first, don't be afraid of it. Easier said than done. But it's not, again, it's like this kind of mystery box that everyone is afraid to touch. Look at the data that if maybe you're working with an analytics team that's managing it and kind of bringing results back to you and that sort of thing. Ask to see the data, or if it's a massive data set that like spans multiple computers, ask to see a subset of it just to get a sense of what's in it and see that it's not mysterious. It's observations and variables, right? It's rows and columns with information. And to me, going back to your question about, conversations with leaders who don't have time to work through the analyses themselves, at least seeing what's in the data set can help you think about what's even a worthy or useful question to ask about it. Oh, I see. We have data on this and this and this. What if we checked this thing, as opposed to just kind of like, what about by year, and casting it? Just seeing it is a start. The second thing I want to say, and I'm going to get in a lot of trouble from my data science purists, is that you can do a lot in Excel, like a lot. You can really get far. And I don't want to underestimate the power of a good crosstab or a bar chart. When I'm doing data science, I start with all of that stuff. And until you've done that work, please don't leap to machine learning or AI or anything like that. I've seen a lot of companies waste a lot of money. Not on me. I'll let them spend money on other teams on that sort of thing. I'm happy to support them. But it's like, you don't need an algorithm to predict leadership in your company. You need a bar chart. That's what you need. Right? Mm-hmm. And the marginal value of something more sophisticated is not always necessarily worth it. Oh my gosh, I've just remembered I'm talking to a group that makes a living selling.
That's what we like you.
Sorry. It's still valuable, right? But know what's in the numbers. Yeah. God. What if it was like, the live stream cut out? That totally was the end of it. I'm so sorry.
Well, Andrea, we're coming up on time. Thank you again so much for spending time with us and sharing all of the great insights that you have. I think that you make amazing contributions to the field of education and certainly social science every day. So thank you for the work generous. That you're doing.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
Of course.
And I love what you're doing. So, and I have capture swag all over the place in my apartment still.
Well, consider yourself an honorary capturite.
Welcome
to the family again.
Awesome. Thank you. You'll be sorry you said that. Yeah, all right. Thanks so much for having me. It's great to see you.